Eleanor Williams's claims that she'd been trafficked by an Asian grooming gang led to protests, racist attacks, and claims of a cover-up. Eventually, she was jailed for lying.
I don't want to be that girl that cries rape. I'm not that person.
I'm Sky News' Jason Farrell, and in Unreliable Witness, we ask, why did she lie? And explore unanswered questions with new revelations. Follow Unreliable Witness wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, this is Leah Boleto in the Sky News studio. On this episode of The Daily, we want to get into some of the big questions after the Moscow concert hall attack, which killed more than 130 people on Friday. You'll have seen some of the pictures on social media feeds over the weekend. Minutes after gunmen burst in, it was packed at the time, frantic pictures. Well, in Russia, people still mourn, with big events cancelled and flags at half-mast. The questions we want to explore today are about the fate of the attack suspects who've appeared in court. You'll have seen pictures too by now, some of them bruised, one in a wheelchair. Also, the US claim that the so-called Islamic State group is responsible. And what about President Putin's claim that Ukraine was involved? We'll get into all of that with our correspondent in Moscow, Diana Magnay, and our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn. We'll start, first of all, with you, Diana. Can you give us a sense of the mood?
Gosh, in the last few weeks, I've seen people lay flowers for Alexei Navalny and now coming to lay flowers at the site of this terrible terror attack. The people of Russia have gone through quite a bit recently. That's very distant from the kind of suffering that the poor people of Ukraine are going through. But, you know, it has struck across the Russian nation, and they haven't experienced something like this since the earlier years of Vladimir Putin's rule, where we had in 2002 this terrible theatre siege, Nordov's theatre siege, where a lot of people lost their lives. And then Beslan, and a few years later, this school, both of which were Chechen terrorists. People are very sad and somber. I mean, yesterday was a day of national mourning. Everywhere you see this same picture of a candle and the words, "We remember." Yesterday, there was a very moving light show at the Crocus City Hall where I am now, and there is a big makeshift memorial of flowers, people still coming on Monday morning, laying more flowers, huge bouquets, lots of teddy bears and toys there too, and candles. I did notice when I ask people, do you have questions for the authorities? Do you think that they failed you? People aren't prepared really to say that. They'll say this is a very difficult environment. I'd prefer not to comment on that kind of thing. And that gives you a sense too of the kind of the nature of the state in which this has taken place.
Diana, what did you make of those striking pictures today then of those four suspects who've appeared in court, bruised, one in a wheelchair? What happened at that hearing?
Well, they were arraigned and remanded for further detention. They clearly showed evident signs of torture. And we saw videos that were released of the security services interrogating them. And one of them had his ear chopped off and it was later stuffed into his mouth. Horrific torture. And I think it's interesting that the authorities don't seem to care about the fact that that is being released into the public domain, or that they've wheeled someone out from hospital in a wheelchair, clearly very injured after interrogation. Russia is signed up to the UN Convention Against Torture, and evidence procured by torture is supposedly inadmissible in court. But I doubt that we'll have much perspective on a court process in any case.
Was there any acknowledgement of the injuries then in the court hearing at all?
The court hearing was closed after the early moments to journalists, and Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, was asked about it in his call today, and he said he wouldn't comment on their appearance.
Interesting. At the Kremlin, Diana, there's been calls, I suppose, for a lifting of that ban on the death penalty. Is there any more you're hearing on that?
I think that's also just a sort of discussion in the public domain rather than anything coming from the Kremlin. Peskov again said that he wouldn't comment on that. I think it's important also to mention Putin, in his really quite brief address on Saturday, didn't lay the blame directly on Ukraine. He just said that the suspects were caught on their way to Ukraine and that a window at the border was being prepared for them. So the suggestion that Ukraine was involved, but he didn't say this was by Ukraine.
This particular type of ISIS, this particular position, can we explain, Dominic, why it's this group that was behind the attack and where they stand and where they're coming from?
Yeah, so ISIS-K is so obviously you had Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, very successful for a while at building what they thought would be the beginnings of a sort of a proto-caliphate. They wanted to create a caliphate, which is kind of Islamic area of control in parts of Syria and Iraq, and they wanted to expand that across the Levant. So they went from Islamic State to Islamic State in the Levant. And then when they were crushed there, they have popped up or become more powerful again in eastern Afghanistan. Khorasan is an area they want to create a caliphate in South Asia. They are fighting the Taliban, so they are particularly hardcore jihadists. They have their own particular brand of jihadism, and as well as trying to create a caliphate, they are particularly effective in acting and operating internationally, particularly in Russia. So they are very much feared by not just Russian security agencies, but also by Western intelligence agencies. And the West seems to be much better at having penetrated them and predicting their next move. They are thought to have tried to carry out a number of attacks in Europe and have been foiled in those efforts.
One of the things that really stood out for me over the weekend is how much Russia actually knew about the possibility of these attacks happening.
Yeah, there are various questions I think still need to be answered, or certainly being asked outside of Russia. One is the fact that the Americans warned the Russians on March the 7th of an imminent threat of an attack by extremists, they said, at places of large gatherings of people. And they actually specifically mentioned concerts. Now, in public, President Putin derided that and said this was just a Western conspiracy to try and divide and intimidate Russia, which is kind of what you'd expect. But privately, you'd expected Russia to have tightened security because even as relations are as strained as they are now, we know the Americans and Russians exchange information about Islamist terrorist threats because it's in their mutual interest to do so, as do other Western countries. And therefore, you'd have thought a Western threat, a warning about an Islamist threat, would have been acted upon. In fact, the opposite seems to have happened. It seems to have been particularly lax security that night. There is a National Guard base a couple of miles down the road from where this attack happened. There are other potential security agencies who could have rushed to the scene, and yet it seemed to have taken a long time for them to have got there. Now, that's raised conspiracy theories in the West that Russia kind of saw this coming and let it happen. Now, you know, whenever you look at Russia, there's the possibility of just a mistake, of incompetence, or there's conspiracy, and Di's in a much better place to sort of take a view on that from where she is in Moscow.
I think because of the way that they view their major threats at the moment through the Ukraine prism, they may also conceive of the US in that context to such an extent that the US is the arch enemy. So even when the US warns them under this sort of duty to warn clause that the US has, that they will share intelligence of any real danger to civilian life should they come across it, that the authorities simply didn't take that seriously enough. And I think also the question of how quickly security forces deployed to the scene. If you look at terror attacks that have taken place in Europe too, it does take some time to sort of recognize what's going on, issue arms to those who need arms issued to them to get to the scene. And I was listening to Mark Galeotti, who's an expert on the Russian security services earlier. He said, you know, it's not as if the National Guard are sitting in their bases with their machine guns at the ready. You do have to find out what's going on, issue the guns, get out, get there. So I'm not sure that, you know, a little over an hour is actually a terrible dereliction of duty, but there is video of arms stashes that were somehow brought inside the Crocus City Hall and used in advance. And frankly, it is a very famous concert area. If you were going to target a place in Moscow, you would probably target that if you wanted maximum effect. So yes, security should have been a lot tighter in the wake of a warning such as that. What is important to note is that that terror warning from the US was for a 48-hour period, and a photographer did capture an image of one of the 4 Tajik attackers in Crocus City Hall on the 7th of March at a concert there. And there were two big concerts of sort of patriotic figures taking place the next couple of days, where the security was tighter. And it is possible that, the attackers decided the security then would have been too tight and they should wait a little bit. This is the kind of speculation that's going around Telegram channels.
Welcome back. I'm still here with our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn, and our international correspondent, Diana Magnay, who is in Moscow. Dominic, the Kremlin are now facing, terrorism at home and a costly war abroad with Ukraine. Do you think this is going to be a turning point for what happens to Putin?
I think the fear, of course, is the way Vladimir Putin and his regime may try and turn this event to their advantage for propaganda reasons, but also to get domestic support for what they seem to be planning in Ukraine, which is an expansion and escalation of activity, because we've seen them now talking specifically about this as being a war, not a special military operation. And I think they probably see as a window of opportunity here. The West is in disarray in terms of funding the Ukrainians, sending enough shells. There may be an attempt to try and to expand and escalate the offensive in Ukraine. And I think the fear is that this could be used by the Putin regime for propaganda purposes to try and support that effort.
Yeah, Diana, let's bring you back in there, because that's a really interesting narrative, isn't it? That how Vladimir Putin, this strongman image that he holds so dearly, how he will use this as a narrative to potentially go full blast in Ukraine.
Well, I certainly think it's helpful for him to have Ukraine in the prism rather than it just having been a failure to protect against Islamist terror when he was warned about it. There's been speculation in the West that he would use it to justify another round of mobilization. I'm not sure that the Russian people would really swallow that. I mean, they've been failed security-wise on their own turf. Surely another round of mobilization, which was incredibly unpopular in the first place, would make them more insecure. I just don't really see the logic tying up. I think Vladimir Putin would be very, very reluctant to call another round of mobilization. He may use it to go harder on Ukraine, but we have said that so many times over the past, whilst we wait to see how much harder he can really go.
Diana, just briefly, what's been the reaction? How is it being reported and spun there where you are in Moscow?
Obfuscation is really one of the sort of key notes of Russian propaganda. So you have the likes of Maria Zakharova, who is the Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman, writing a long article today talking about how ISIS was effectively the creation, a monster of the US's own creation, and now they're using it as the bogeyman in this attack. I'm not quite sure what her point is, but, behind everything is the specter of the West and the United States. And she's saying, they are trying to cover up their sponsorship of the Ukrainian terror regime. You have similar sort of stuff coming from the head of RT, Margarita Simonyan. You have a lot of the papers discussing the possibility of ISIS being involved, quoting Western media as saying ISIS was involved, but also trying to detect a Ukrainian trace, which is the sort of phrasing that Russia always uses. So I think there's confusion. There's a lot of different speculation. When you talk to people on the ground, they'll either say to you, well, I think it's too early really to tell, or we are in a very difficult situation as a country. Anything is possible. It is possible that the Ukrainians were somehow involved in persuading ISIS either way. So, I mean, there is a lot of rope for these conspiracies to go for. I mean, the fact that they were captured in the Bryansk region, which is en route either to Belarus or Ukraine, is strange. Even if they got to Belarus, you would have thought that they would be caught there pretty pronto. Although crossing that border would be easier than crossing into Ukraine and then crossing a front line. But I think these are just one of the many, many questions that remain to be answered, and which I don't think will get satisfactory answers from the Russians from when the investigative committee does come out with their summary of what they think happened.
And Dominic, your thoughts on the reaction from the rest of the world, in particular France?
The French have 3 terror levels, and they've raised it to the highest level, which means that they believe there is a very significant risk of a terrorist attack happening in France in the imminent or immediate future. So they're very worried, I think, by ISIS-K's activity, not just what happened in Moscow, but also what is reported to have been foiled in recent weeks. In Britain, there are 5 levels of threat, from low to critical, and we're at substantial, and that's not been increased. Now, substantial means an attack is likely. Critical means an attack is highly likely in the near future. Basically, that would be when the government believes, or the authorities believe, they have evidence an attack is about to happen. What we're going to hear from the West, of course, is that Putin tried to launch this war to make Russians safer. And they will say, of course, this is another example, even though this has nothing to do with Ukraine. The West will say that of Russia becoming a more dangerous place, and the Russian people being more threatened because of this war, because they will say the Russians dropped their guard, distracted by the Ukraine war, and let these Islamists carry out this appalling attack.
I wonder your thoughts then on this ISIS-K attack on Moscow. It makes the world a much more dangerous place now.
It makes Russia a more dangerous place, and I think the question is, if they're able to do it once in Russia, will they try and do it again? And it shows I think it just shows that ISIS-K is a very effective, potentially a very dangerous organisation, and for that reason, it's watched very closely. And Western intelligence is believed to have penetrated it pretty effectively, to the extent that they have foiled several attacks in the West in recent weeks and months. And obviously that guard will be raised, as it has in France. The British may believe they don't need to raise the threat level, but certainly they'll be on their guard and preparing for potential attacks in the UK, as will European countries. I think it highlights the problems Russia faces in being very stretched now, fighting a war, but also facing this ongoing Islamist threat that has threatened them for years now.
Thanks so much to Diana and Dominic. That's all from me today. We will be back tomorrow.